Happy Tuesday, Humanities kids. As promised, here is the video lecture for part 1 of Enlightenment philosophy. And we're going to start just on the Schoology page. I do want to point out to you the updates that I've been posting. Your welcome back from break video, your Humanities remote learning memo. Thank you to those of you who've actually looked at it. So if you have not read through that memo and or watched the video, please do that. And then here is where I'm going to be posting your agendas for each day. Okay, and I'll try to give you what we're doing the next class and then what we're doing on that day. Under materials is where you'll find the PowerPoint, right? And it is underneath the subfolder labeled PowerPoints. And it is the Survey of Western Philosophy PowerPoint that we are working on today. And you can pull it up here. The formatting gets a little weird on Schoology, so I went ahead and just downloaded it so that you guys can see the original version. And all right. It is spazzing out. Let's try to get it. Okay, so before break, we went through early modern philosophers, and we talked about the Renaissance, and basically, I think we got through Isaac Newton. Okay, we talked about Protestant Reformation, scientific revolution, etc., etc. We talked about the 95 Theses. You should have all of this in your notes. Okay, and we talked about Machiavelli. There is going to be an excerpt of his book, The Prince, that you guys will read. I will put that on Schoology, but remember, for this week, we're just acclimating ourselves and catching up on some of the content. But that will be coming, and it'll be posted on Schoology. We talked a little bit about Thomas Hobbes. I'm going to post an excerpt of his text, The Leviathan, for those of you who would be interested in reading it. I know some of you expressed desire to read more primary source text documents, so I will post that. It's just a really high lexile, so it was not going to be required, but you're more than welcome to read it to enhance your learning. And we talked about Francis Bacon and empiricism and rationalism with Rene Descartes. And I think, therefore I am, a priori knowledge, and then Isaac Newton. Okay, so we're moving into the Enlightenment. And the thing about the Enlightenment is that it is a combination of rationalism, so the assertion that knowledge comes from reason and logic in the mind, and empiricism, which we talked about with Francis Bacon. Okay. The people that we're going to be looking at, John Locke. We don't really talk a whole lot about David Hume, but there are some interesting texts by him. Immanuel Kant, Soren Kierkegaard, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And the ethos of this particular era is question everything. Okay. So that's why in this time period, right, so we're looking at 1700 to 1900, revolutions start to happen during this time period because people are questioning everything. This is 1700s and 1800s. And this is, right, so American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution is shortly thereafter. They explored ideas about natural rights, which is directly related to Thomas Hobbes' assertion that we are born equal, but societal structures make us unequal. But it's much more than just politics. For example, we're looking at the juxtaposition of tradition versus change. Okay, so old ways versus the new ways. Science versus religion. God exists as the creator, or the universe is all there is. Empiricism and rationalism. And then humanism versus religion. So essentially, the ism that says that man is inherently good versus the religion of the time that asserted that man is inherently evil. Okay, and this goes all the way back to Mengsa and Zengsa that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester. All right. So these are the two isms that are kind of in conflict with one another. All right. Empiricism, they both start with E here. So knowledge comes from experience. So the empirical experience through the five senses. That is how we arrive at truth. That's how we arrive at knowledge. That's what an empiricist would believe. Rationalists believe that knowledge comes from reason and logic in the mind. It doesn't matter what we experience in the real world. It matters what we think about. Okay? And so on the rationalist side, we have René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and then on the empiricist side, we have Galileo and David Hume. And actually John Locke is over here as well. We're going to talk about him. John Locke is the British empiricist who sort of influenced the Declaration of Independence. So because of him, we have a lot of the ideas that we hold true as Americans here. We owe to the Brits. Okay. So if you remember a priori knowledge, which is what we talked about with rationalism, a priori knowledge is the statement that knowledge precedes our experience. It's a rationalist viewpoint. Okay. We know things before we experience them. John Locke and other empiricists believe that we have a posteriori knowledge, so knowledge based on our experience. It does not come from within, it comes from without. Okay, and that's the roots here, a priori, okay, and a posteriori tell us exactly what they mean. Prior, so before experience. Posteriori, posterior means after or end, and so it's after experience. You've probably heard this, hopefully, in your history classes, but tabula rasa is that blank slate. Some of you talked about that when we wrote our argument pieces about human nature being good or evil. Okay, we fill that blank slate with knowledge and experience, and that's what defines what we know as true and who we are. And then he also, as I said earlier, argued for natural rights, which influenced the American Revolution directly, its founding fathers, our founding documents. And he stated in his treatises and essays that we have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. We must give consent to a government for them to govern us. That should be familiar language to you. It is quoted in the Declaration of Independence. The only thing that changes is that we change property to the pursuit of happiness. And here it is. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is directly from John Locke. So hopefully what you're seeing is a connection between the philosophical ideals of the time and the events in history that define nations. If it weren't for John Locke, if it weren't for Thomas Hobbes, if it weren't for all these people, these predecessors of these Enlightenment thinkers, we wouldn't have the foundation of the country that we have today. Here's a good example or explanation of empiricism. Okay, and I know I'm going very quickly. It's because this free version of the screencasting is only a 15-minute allowance, so you can always go back and rewind if you need to. But basically, an empiricist would say, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. That's supposed to say doesn't make a sound, not doesn't make a sound, but I digress. Okay, so an empiricist would answer this question this way. No, there is no sound, since sound does not exist without our perception of it. Okay. An extreme rationalist would say, yes, there is sound because sound exists outside of our perception of it. Okay. So obviously, both of these extreme responses have issues with them, but this is a good illustration of how one side thinks. Okay, an empiricist says no, if you don't hear it, it doesn't make a sound, because a sound's purpose is to be heard, right? So the real question underlying these isms is there such a thing as sound if we don't hear that sound? Does it negate its existence as a sound if there's no one there to hear it? Because if you define sound as something that is heard, if no one's there to hear it, is it really a sound, right? There's not really an answer to that question, but these are the kinds of questions that philosophers are asking, right? So think about where you would fall on that spectrum. Are you saying, like the empiricists, that if there's no one there to hear the sound, then the sound doesn't really exist? Or do those sound waves rationally exist outside of our perception of it? The more you think about this, the more trippy it gets. But that's a pretty solid explanation of what these isms represent. And again, we know that I'm giving you the SparkNotes version, right? I'm simplifying this as best I can so that we can cover as much as we can get covered in a semester-long course, which does not do this kind of content justice. But hopefully this is helpful. Okay, Immanuel Kant is Prussian. Okay, he tried to resolve issues between rationalism and empiricism. Okay, so he suggested that the mind, so our rational side, and our experiences, the empirical side of us, are necessary for knowledge. We need to bridge them together. Okay, and so that's where we are now in this sort of postmodern world, where we don't really think one is more right than the other. We're kind of bridging them together. So here's what makes Kant unique. Okay, instead of believing that our mind just records what's going on in the world, he says that it constitutes or makes up or builds or shapes the world. So the world conforms to our mind, not the other way around. And we call that transcendental idealism. And we look at the roots here. The ideal that we have is what our mind sees the world as, and then it transcends the physical realm. So our mind sort of conforms the world to fit our interpretation of it. The other element of Kant and his works is we talk about Kantian ethics and the moral imperative, and that's something that we will hopefully have time to talk about. Since we are doing remote learning, I'm having to change some of the things that we're having time to do, but ideally we will get to touch on that before the end of the semester. And this is a diagram that shows kind of the influence of Immanuel Kant. So we are kind of at a pivotal moment in history here in the mid-1700s because all of these philosophers from all over the world, so we have some Eastern philosophers here with Mao, and then we have Fidel Castro, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, okay, all the way down to Heidegger. These are all influenced by Immanuel Kant. So he's kind of like the founder of modern philosophy because most prevalent philosophical schools of thought find their roots in the thinking of Immanuel Kant. We talk about Marx and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. We touch a little bit on Sartre and Freud and Camus, but as you can tell, like there's a whole lot of people that we don't get to. Okay. And then Kierkegaard, and this is where we'll stop because this is a pretty good stopping point. The Melancholic Dane is where, the Melancholic Dane is who introduces existentialism to us. Okay, ideas that relate to existentialism existed before this dude, but he sort of founds it. Okay, so he's Danish. He's the father of existentialism, which here it's important for you to know this definition. It's finding meaning in the subjective experiences of life. So meaning is subjective, not objective, according to an existentialist. What's unique about Kierkegaard is that he was also Christian. So he believed that true value was found in the subjective experiences of humanity, but he also was a strong adherent to the Christian faith, believed in religious encounters with the divine, and believed in absolutes such as God. Okay, so he's wrestling with two sort of disparate ideologies here, and he makes them work together. He proposed that truth is subjectivity and subjectivity is truth, since everyone experiences different things in life. And so his definitions of truth and subjectivity are important here, and we will talk more about that. Okay. Existentialism is going to continue when we talk about Friedrich Nietzsche, and then again when we move on to absurdism, because absurdism is essentially existentialism on steroids, and then nihilism is essentially absurdism on steroids. So we're going to talk about those things. If you are interested, there is a really funny Twitter that is called Kim Kierkegaardashian, which basically tweets Kierkegaard's ideologies, but from the perspective of Kim Kardashian. I highly recommend you follow them. It'll help you understand this particular man's influence on our modern thought. Okay? And that is part 1 for Enlightenment. We will continue this next week. I hope you guys are doing well. Email me with any questions, and I'll be available live tomorrow during the allotted time that I put on Schoology.